A black FBI agent was pulled over and assaulted by a white police officer, but just a few hours later, the officer faced a terrible consequence for his arrogance. The red and blue lights flashed behind him, cutting through the quiet stretch of highway like a blade. Levi Tate exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the wheel. He wasn't speeding. His tags were up to date. There was no reason for this stop, but he knew better than to ask why. He knew better than to expect fairness at this hour, on this road, in this state. He pulled to the side, the gravel crunching under his tires. The night was thick, the desert stretching wide on both sides, an emptiness that swallowed sound. A perfect place for trouble. A car door slammed behind him. Heavy boots approached, deliberate, unhurried. Levi watched in the rearview mirror as Victor Hensley emerged, lean and angular, a cigarette dangling between his lips. The sheriff's uniform fit him like a second skin, the badge gleaming under the glow of the patrol car's lights. The man didn't speak at first. Instead, he took his time. A slow drag from his cigarette. A glance over Levi's car like it was some roach he found crawling up his sleeve. Then, tapping the ash onto the pavement, he rapped his baton twice on the hood. Tap, tap, before leaning down to the driver's side window. Step out of the car. Levi's jaw tensed. No license and registration. No, do you know why I pulled you over? Just straight to it. He knew the drill. Hands visible. Slow movements. No sudden gestures. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pushed open the door, and stepped out. That was when Jacob Rollins moved in. The second officer, shorter, broader, younger, grabbed Levi by the collar before his feet were even firm on the ground. A hard yank forward, the force making him stumble. Then, before he could steady himself, the baton came down, straight to his ribs. Pain exploded across his side. His breath hitched, legs buckling slightly as he caught himself on the car. "The fuck was that for?" Levi hissed, voice strained. Hensley smirked, tossing his cigarette onto the ground and crushing it under his boot. "Oh, don't play dumb, boy. You know exactly why." Levi forced himself upright, swallowing the fire in his ribs. "I'm FBI, Special Agent Levi Tate, Director of the Houston Field Office." He spoke clearly, locking eyes with Hensley. "You're making a mistake." Hensley's smirk widened. "Oh, is that right?" He stepped in closer, the scent of cheap tobacco and whiskey rolling off him. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he turned and spat, right at Levi's feet. "You think that badge means a damn thing out here?" Hensley muttered, voice low and full of quiet amusement. "Out here, we don't give a shit what title Uncle Sam slapped on you. Out here, we see one thing." He leaned in further, so close that Levi could see the faint scars along his jawline, the years of hard living etched into his skin. "And that's the color of your damn skin." A fresh wave of anger burned through Levi's veins, but he clenched his teeth, forcing himself to keep his breathing steady. Rollins chuckled from behind, shifting his baton from one hand to the other. "What's wrong, Agent? Ain't used to getting treated like the rest of 'em?" Hensley laughed at that, shaking his head. "That's the problem, ain't it? Some of y'all think you're better than the rest. Climb a few rungs up the ladder and suddenly you forget what you really are." He reached down, tapping the FBI badge clipped to Levi's belt. Then, with a sharp flick of his wrist, he ripped it off and tossed it onto the dirt beside them. Levi's fists curled. His pulse hammered in his ears, his entire body coiled tight like a live wire. He had been in dangerous situations before. He had faced down cartel enforcers, domestic terrorists, men with nothing to lose. But this was something different. This wasn't a battle of skill. It wasn't a question of training or experience. This was a game, a sick, twisted game they had played before. And they knew they could win. Hensley clicked his tongue, shaking his head in mock disappointment. Ain't no badge in the world that can change what you are. Then the baton came down again, harder this time, straight to Levi's stomach. He doubled over, the air ripped from his lungs in a sharp, choking gasp. He barely had a second before Rollins grabbed him by the back of the neck and shoved him forward, slamming him chest first against the hood of his own car. A knee pressed into his spine. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped tight around his wrists. Hensley took his time fishing his radio from his belt. "We got ourselves a suspect resisting arrest here," he said lazily. "Better bring him in for processing." Levi's teeth gritted as he forced the words out, his breath still jagged. What am I being charged with?" Hensley chuckled. "Oh, don't worry about that. We'll figure something out by the time we get to the station." Levi shut his eyes. He was in deep now. And if he didn't find a way to flip this script, he wasn't getting out. The cuffs were too tight, biting into Levi's wrists as the patrol car rumbled over uneven asphalt. Every jolt sent another sharp reminder that Rollins had made sure those metal rings weren't going anywhere. Hensley drove at a leisurely pace, fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel, the glow of the dashboard lights casting shadows across his face. "You know," he mused, not bothering to look back, "I've been doing this job a long time. Long enough to know the real threats ain't the ones running the streets with guns." Rollins chuckled, shifting in his seat. "Nah, the real threats are the ones who think they're better than the rest of us. The ones who think some fancy title means they don't have to answer to the law." Levi remained silent, jaw locked, his breathing steady despite the sharp ache in his ribs. He knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted a reaction, anger, frustration, even a single word of protest, something they could twist, something they could use against him later. He refused to give them that satisfaction. The ride stretched longer than necessary, the route winding through back roads and empty lots, far from city lights and passing cars. Every sudden stop, every sharp turn, every deliberate slam of the brakes was designed to disorient him, to remind him who controlled the night. He stayed upright, feet planted, eyes fixed on the barred partition separating him from his captors. When they finally pulled into the station, the parking lot was eerily quiet. A few officers stood near the entrance, their conversations halting as they turned to watch. No one stepped forward to intervene. No one asked questions. They all knew what was happening, and they all chose to look away. Hensley cut the engine and let out a long, satisfied breath. "Well now, let's get you all settled in, Agent." Levi said nothing as Rollins yanked open the door and dragged him out, twisting his arms just enough to send a fresh wave of pain through his shoulders. He barely had time to adjust his footing before he was shoved forward, the harsh, fluorescent lights of the station burning his eyes after the darkness of the patrol car. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of old coffee and sweat, a faint buzz of police radios humming in the background. The usual booking procedures, fingerprints, mugshots, paperwork, never came. Instead, they marched him straight past the front desk, through a dimly lit hallway, and into a small, windowless room with nothing but a metal table and 2 chairs. The door clanged shut behind them, the lock clicking into place. Hensley and Rollins took their time, moving with the kind of unhurried ease that came from knowing they had all the power in the room. Hensley dropped a manila folder onto the table, sliding it toward Levi with a smirk. "Bet you're wondering what happens next." Levi kept his expression unreadable, watching as Hensley flipped the folder open, revealing a neatly typed police report. Even from where he sat, the words at the top were unmistakable. Suspect, Levi Tate. Charges: assaulting an officer, resisting arrest. Go on, take a look. Ain't it neat? Even got a couple witness statements to back it up, Hensley said, feigning admiration. Rollins leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Yeah, turns out some folks saw you getting real aggressive out there. Screaming, fighting, even threw a punch. Crazy, huh? Levi didn't flinch, though his mind was already racing. This wasn't just a bad arrest. They weren't just trying to humiliate him or throw him in a cell for a few hours. They were setting up something bigger, something that wouldn't be undone by a simple phone call to his FBI superiors. They were planning to destroy him. Hensley, still watching for a reaction, let out a short laugh and reached for his phone. A few taps later, he turned the screen toward Levi. The grainy footage that played was edited just enough to strip away context, showing only what they wanted the world to see. It captured Levi outside his car, voice raised, hands moving fast. Then, a sudden lunge, carefully framed to make it appear as if he had gone after Hensley first. The video cut off before anything else was shown. At the bottom of the screen, the caption read, "FBI Director arrested after attacking officers. Is this who we trust?" The comment section beneath it was already overflowing with venom. Another thug in a suit. These people never change. Cops should have put him down right there. Levi inhaled slowly, willing his pulse to stay steady. This was the real game. It wasn't just about framing him for a crime. It was about turning the world against him before he even had a chance to fight back. Hensley leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. See, it don't matter what really happened. What matters is what people believe happened. Rollins, still grinning, added, "And right now, they're believing exactly what we want them to." The weight of the situation settled heavily in Levi's chest. Even if he walked out of here, his name was already being dragged through the mud. His authority, his reputation, his years of service, none of it would matter in the face of a manufactured narrative designed to reduce him to nothing more than a stereotype. "So, what's the next move?" Levi finally asked, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. Hensley feigned surprise, as if he hadn't expected him to play along. "Oh, that's easy. We keep you here till morning. Let the story spread a little more. Then, maybe we find some evidence in your car. Maybe a little bag of something illegal. Hell, maybe a weapon." Rollins chuckled. "Man like you, traveling alone? Bound to have something suspicious, right?" Levi met their eyes, reading the smug certainty in their faces. They thought they had already won. They thought he had nowhere to turn, no way to fight back. But they were wrong. Tucked inside the lining of his jacket, still active, still transmitting, was his emergency comms device. And right now, somewhere out there, someone was listening, watching, coming. Levi leaned back, his lips curling into the barest hint of a smile. "Well, boys, looks like we're in for a long night." The room was silent for a long moment. Hensley leaned back in his chair, watching Levi with narrowed eyes, as if he were sizing up a wounded animal, deciding whether to put it down or let it limp away. Rollins, standing off to the side, cracked his knuckles absent-mindedly, the ghost of a smirk still on his face. They thought they had him, thought they'd crushed whatever fight he had left. Then the first tremor hit. A low, distant rumble that vibrated through the walls, followed by the unmistakable sound of rotor blades cutting through the night. Hensley's smirk faltered just slightly, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. Levi saw the flicker of realization pass over his face, the brief moment where the certainty of his control cracked. It was the sound of a black hawk, and it was getting closer. The radio at Hensley's hip crackled to life. A voice, sharp and urgent, filled the room. "This is Special Agent Hayes. We have a federal warrant for the immediate release of Levi Tate. I suggest you comply." Hensley didn't move at first. His jaw worked, his knuckles white where they gripped the chair. Levi could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, the desperate search for a way out, a way to twist the situation back in his favor. But there wasn't one. Not now. Another voice came through the radio, this one from outside the station. "We got multiple units in position. I repeat, stand down and release the suspect." Hensley exhaled sharply through his nose. He turned to Rollins, giving a slow nod. "Uncuff him." Rollins hesitated. "Vic, do it." The cuffs came off with a sharp click, the metal still warm against Levi's skin. He rubbed his wrists, feeling the dull throb where they had been cinched too tight. Slowly, deliberately, he stood. Hensley pushed back from the table, rising to his feet. His face was composed now, the brief moment of uncertainty buried beneath something colder, sharper. "This ain't over," he said quietly. Levi met his eyes. "No, it's not." The door swung open, and the hallway beyond was filled with the sight of armed FBI agents sweeping through the station, their movements precise, methodical. Hayes was at the front, his expression unreadable as he locked eyes with Levi. Without a word, he stepped aside, motioning for him to walk. Levi didn't look back. Outside, the helicopter's spotlight illuminated the parking lot in harsh white light. More federal agents were stationed around the perimeter, their rifles lowered but ready. As Levi stepped into the open air, the weight of the night settled over him. He was free, but he knew, even as the cuffs were gone and his feet moved toward the waiting vehicle, that this wasn't victory. This was just the beginning. The news broke within the hour. By the time Levi reached the Houston field office, his name was already plastered across every screen, every website, every talking head panel. The headlines varied, but the message was clear. FBI director released after allegedly attacking officers. Was it abuse of power? He stood in the conference room, arms crossed as the footage played on a loop. The edited video of his arrest had already gone viral, but now it was accompanied by something new, an interview with Victor Hensley. The man sat in his uniform, a bandage neatly placed over his forehead, a performance of pain carefully orchestrated. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man who was simply doing his duty. "I never expected someone like Agent Tate to react the way he did. It was supposed to be a routine stop. But the moment I asked for his identification, he became aggressive. I tried to de-escalate. But as you can see from the footage, well, I'm just lucky to be sitting here today." Levi's fingers curled into a fist. Hayes sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're building a narrative, and it's spreading fast." Levi already knew that. He didn't need to read the comments, didn't need to scroll through the endless opinions being thrown around. The damage was being done in real time, and the more the story grew, the harder it would be to undo. "They're painting you as the aggressor," Hayes continued, "and people are eating it up." Of course they were, because that was how it worked. People believed what they wanted to believe. They saw the skin before they saw the truth. "Threats started coming in an hour ago," another agent said from the corner of the room. "Most of it's online, but some of it's more direct. Calls to your house, to Lena's work." Levi exhaled slowly, his stomach tightening. "She and Jamal, they're safe. For now." For now. The words settled like lead in his chest. He had spent his life fighting to be more than what the world assumed him to be. He had worked twice as hard, been twice as careful, made sure there was never a crack in the armor, never a moment of weakness that could be used against him. And none of it had mattered. Because when the system wanted to break you, it didn't need proof. It didn't need reason. It just needed an audience willing to believe the lie. Levi turned away from the screen, staring out the window at the city below. They wanted him silent. They wanted him afraid. But he wasn't going to give them what they wanted. The city stretched out beneath him, glittering under the night sky, indifferent to the chaos brewing behind its walls. Levi stood at the window, arms crossed, the weight of the last 24 hours pressing against his ribs. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. The phone on the desk buzzed again. Another message, another threat. He didn't need to check. He already knew what it would say. The same bile that had been flooding in all day, the same slurs, the same promises of violence. They weren't just trying to scare him. They wanted him to feel it in his bones, to know that he wasn't safe, that no badge, no title, no amount of authority would protect him from what they believed he deserved. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Hayes stepped in, his face tight, his phone clutched in his hand. He didn't bother with small talk. "It's getting worse," he said. "The threats, the media storm. They're calling for an internal review of your actions." Levi exhaled slowly. "Let me guess. By a committee full of the same people who want me out?" Hayes didn't answer. He didn't have to. Levi turned back to the window, fingers drumming against his arm. He could feel the city watching him, waiting to see what his next move would be. "The extremists are rallying," Hayes continued. "We intercepted chatter on a few forums. They're calling you a traitor, saying you're part of some deep state conspiracy to take down law enforcement." He hesitated. "And they know where you live." That caught Levi's attention. His eyes flicked toward Hayes. "They've posted photos of your house, of Lena's office, Jamal's school." A slow, cold rage settled in Levi's chest. It was one thing for them to come after him. He had expected that. But this was a line they weren't supposed to cross. "They're watching you," Hayes said. "There's been a black pickup circling your neighborhood for hours. We've got a team monitoring it, but it's only a matter of time before someone decides to take a shot." Levi's jaw clenched. "And what's the Bureau going to do? Put me in protective custody? Hide me away while they run me through a sham investigation?" Hayes sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We can assign detail to you, to your family, but you know how this goes. We can't guard you forever. The moment the heat dies down, they'll pull us back, and you'll be on your own." Levi already knew that. He'd seen it before, cases where agents became political scapegoats, where the institution they served threw them to the wolves to protect itself. The Bureau would do what it always did, distance itself, let the public eat its own until they found a new controversy to fixate on. But this wasn't going away. Not unless he made sure of it. Levi grabbed his phone, scrolling through the endless stream of notifications. News articles, opinion pieces, interviews with so-called experts, dissecting his every move. The video of his arrest had already been viewed over 3 million times. His name was trending nationwide, but not as a victim, as a villain. "How do we flip it?" he asked, voice level. Hayes frowned. "Flip what?" "The narrative. They're winning because they control the story. If we want a shot at taking them down, we have to make sure the truth is louder than the lie." Hayes hesitated. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Levi said. "But we can't just sit here waiting for them to build the gallows. We have to hit back." For a moment, Hayes just looked at him, then exhaled sharply. "There's one way." Levi waited. "An interview. A national broadcast. You sit down, tell your side, let people see who you are beyond the edited clips. We control the message before they bury you completely." Levi considered it. It was risky. Stepping into the public eye meant painting a bigger target on his back, meant exposing his family even more. But what was the alternative? Sit in the shadows while they tore him apart? Let the world believe he was the monster they wanted him to be? No, that wasn't an option. "Set it up," he said. Hayes nodded, already dialing. "I'll make the call." As he left the room, Levi sank into the chair, rubbing his temples. His mind was already racing, calculating every possible attack they'd throw his way. He knew Hensley wouldn't take this lying down. The extremists wouldn't either. They would push back, harder than before. His phone vibrated again. Another message. "You think you can talk your way out of this, boy? You ain't safe. None of y'all are." Levi stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted the message. Levi put the phone down, his fingers lingering on the desk. The weight of the threats, the smear campaign, the way the world seemed determined to twist reality, it was all pressing in, heavy and suffocating. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. The interview was set. National broadcast. Prime time. Hayes had made the arrangements, pulled strings, made sure they got a fair platform. This was Levi's chance to turn the tide, to show the unedited footage, to lay out the truth before the lies became too deeply rooted. He knew exactly how Hensley and his people would react. They would fight like hell to silence him. And he was right. The morning of the press conference, security at the venue was tight. Federal agents stationed at the entrances, plainclothes officers in the crowd. The threats had been credible enough to warrant extra precautions. But what they weren't prepared for, what no one was ever fully prepared for, was the rage of a mob that had already made up its mind. Levi stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding. The cameras were rolling. Reporters sat poised with their recorders and notebooks, waiting. His hands rested firmly on the podium. The statement he had prepared was in front of him, but before he could say the first word, it started. Yelling from the back, shouting that grew louder, angrier, surging forward like a wave. "Traitor! FBI's corrupt! You ain't one of us!" A group of men pushed through the barricades, their signs held high, their faces twisted with fury. "FBI betrayed America. Texas don't need you. Go back to where you belong." Levi knew what that meant. Security moved in fast, intercepting the worst of them, pushing them back before they could reach the stage. Reporters turned their cameras toward the chaos. Within seconds, what was meant to be a controlled statement became a spectacle, the truth drowned out by the noise. The press conference ended before it even began. Later, as he sat in the back of a black SUV, staring at the news coverage, Levi felt that cold, familiar frustration settle in. The headlines weren't about the evidence he had planned to present. They weren't about the unedited footage that proved Hensley had attacked first. They were about the protests. Levi Tate's press conference erupts in chaos. Tensions rise as FBI director faces backlash. Public divided over Levi Tate scandal. Not one mention of the real issue. Not one acknowledgement of the corruption. Hayes sat beside him, rubbing his temples. "They're controlling the story. They always do. If we release the video now, they'll just say it's been doctored," Hayes muttered. "They'll call it manipulation, say you're just trying to cover your ass. Levi exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against his knee. Then we take it somewhere else. Somewhere they can't twist it. Hayes frowned. What do you mean? Their media isn't going to tell the truth, but ours might. Levi knew exactly where he had to go. That night, he made the calls. He reached out to activists, independent journalists, people who had spent years fighting the same war he was now caught in. They weren't bound by corporate networks, weren't afraid to expose what the system wanted buried. And they believed him. They saw the uncut footage for what it was. Within hours, the truth began to spread. Videos of the real arrest, showing how Hensley had initiated the violence. Testimonies from people who had worked under him, exposing his history of abuse. Reports on the deep-rooted corruption within the El Paso department. The mainstream networks wouldn't touch it, but the internet was another battlefield entirely. And the tide started to shift. People who had called for Levi's resignation now hesitated. The voices demanding justice grew louder. The extremists doubled down, but cracks began to form in the wall of lies. Then, something unexpected happened. Levi had been combing through financial records, documents he'd gotten from a contact inside the bureau, files they weren't supposed to have access to. And there it was. A string of unaccounted transactions. Large sums of money moving between private accounts, all linked back to Hensley. But he wasn't the end of the trail. There was another name. Someone higher. Someone pulling the strings. A name that sent a chill down Levi's spine. Clyde Warren, the mayor of El Paso. Levi sat back in his chair, the gravity of it sinking in. Hensley wasn't just another racist cop on a power trip. He was working for something bigger, something deeper. And if Levi wanted to take this fight all the way to the top, he was going to have to go after the man who really ran the show. Levi sat motionless, staring at the name on the screen. Clyde Warren. It had always felt bigger than Hensley, but now he had proof. The mayor of El Paso wasn't just some politician looking the other way. He was orchestrating the whole thing. The money transfers, the protection, the way Hensley had moved with such confidence, like he knew no matter what he did, someone had his back. It all made sense now. Levi exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. The weight of it settled on his shoulders. He knew exactly what this meant. Taking down Hensley was one thing. He was just a piece on the board. But going after Warren, that was war. He reached for his phone, scrolling past the endless notifications, news alerts, threats, messages of support that felt smaller in the face of what was coming. He dialed a number. Hayes picked up on the first ring. "You need to see this," Levi said. There was silence on the other end, then a quiet sigh. "I was hoping you wouldn't say that." Within the hour, Levi was back at the Bureau's field office, sitting across from Hayes, the dim light of the room making the tension between them even heavier. Levi pushed the files across the table, watching as Hayes flipped through them. "Jesus Christ," Hayes muttered, shaking his head. "This is bigger than I thought." Levi leaned forward. "We don't have time to play this careful. Warren's got resources. The longer we wait, the more he'll cover his tracks." Hayes nodded slowly but didn't look up. "You know what this means, right? Taking down a sitting mayor? That's not just a corruption case, that's career suicide. And not just for you, for me, for anyone who signs off on this." Levi held his gaze. "I didn't sign up for this job to keep my head down. If we don't go after him, we're saying it's okay, that we'll let it slide. I can't do that." Hayes exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Then, after a long pause, he reached for his phone. "All right, let's do this." The investigation moved fast. Too fast. Levi had been in the game long enough to know when someone was scared. The Bureau's internal team didn't hesitate like they normally did when a high-profile figure was on the line. The charges piled up quickly: bribery, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. Hensley's financial records led to shell companies, and those companies led straight to Warren. The net was closing, and for the first time in this whole mess, Levi felt like they were finally ahead. But Warren wasn't the type to go down without a fight. The media campaign kicked into overdrive. Hensley was painted as the real victim, a man simply enforcing the law who had been targeted by a corrupt FBI agent with a political agenda. Talking heads on conservative networks repeated the same narrative. Levi was dangerous, a threat, part of some larger movement to dismantle law enforcement. And then came the death threats. Levi was used to them by now, but these felt different, more direct, more urgent. His address was leaked. Lena's office was flooded with phone calls. A black SUV had been spotted circling Jamal's school. Hayes pulled Levi into his office, his face drawn tight. "You need to get out of town," he said. Levi almost laughed. "You think running is going to fix this?" "No, I think staying is going to get you killed." Hayes ran a hand through his hair, looking more exhausted than Levi had ever seen him. "We've got protection on your family, but it won't hold forever. These people aren't just making noise anymore. They're planning something." Levi stared at the floor. He knew Hayes was right, but this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. Hensley was arrested first, dragged out of his home in the early hours of the morning. He didn't go quietly. The images of him fighting against the officers went viral, fueling both sides of the debate. To his supporters, he was a martyr. To everyone else, he was a criminal who had finally been caught. Levi watched the footage from his office, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. He should have felt relief. He should have felt like this was a victory. But it wasn't over yet. Warren was still out there. 2 nights later, Levi came home to an empty house. The living room felt colder than usual, the silence stretching too long. He set his keys on the table, glancing toward the kitchen. A note sat on the counter, the envelope worn at the edges, like it had been held for too long before being left there. He didn't have to read it to know what it said. Still, he opened it, unfolding the paper with careful hands. "Levi, I can't do this anymore. I love you. I always will. But I can't live like this. I can't raise Jamal in a world where every time the phone rings, I wonder if it's bad news. Where I have to explain to our son why people want his father dead. I wish things were different. I wish you didn't have to fight this fight, but I can't keep standing in the fire with you. I hope, someday, you understand. Lena." Levi let the paper slip from his fingers, his chest tightening. He had known this was coming. Had felt it in the way Lena had been quieter these past few weeks, the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. He had told himself they would make it through, that once the dust settled, things would go back to normal. But there was no normal after this. He sat down slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He had won. Hensley was in jail. Warren was on the run. The system that had tried to break him was finally being exposed. And yet, at that moment, all he could feel was the empty space Lena and Jamal had left behind. Justice had come at a cost, and Levi Tate was the one paying it. Levi sat in the quiet of his empty house, the weight of it pressing down on him in a way that even the threats, the violence, the fight itself never had. The echoes of laughter that once filled the rooms were gone. The scent of Lena's perfume had faded. Jamal's toys, left behind in the rush, still sat in the corner, untouched. He had won the battle, but lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered. His phone buzzed again. Another call. Another request. The world wanted to hear from him. News networks, civil rights groups, universities. Everyone wanted Levi Tate to speak, to tell his story, to be the face of the movement. He should have felt something, pride, maybe, a sense of purpose. Instead, all he felt was exhaustion. A month ago, he had been an FBI director, a man with a job, a family, a life. Now, he was a symbol, and symbols didn't get to rest. He finally picked up one of the calls. The voice on the other end was familiar. A journalist he had spoken to before, one of the few who had actually cared about the truth. "We're putting together a panel," the man said. "National broadcast. We want you on it." Levi exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Who else is going to be there?" "A couple of civil rights leaders, a former police chief from Chicago, and, well, Hensley's lawyer is pushing for him to call in from prison." Levi almost laughed at that. He really thinks people still want to hear what he has to say. You'd be surprised. Levi wasn't. Not anymore. He agreed to the interview, even though he already knew how it would go. It wouldn't matter how much evidence he had, how many people had seen the truth with their own eyes. The other side would keep fighting, twisting the story, convincing people that Levi was the villain. The night of the interview, the studio was buzzing. Cameras, producers, makeup people flitting around like they were setting up a damn prize fight. Levi sat in the chair, microphone clipped to his jacket, watching the countdown clock tick down. Then the screen across from him lit up. Hensley's face appeared, calling in from prison, looking smug despite the orange jumpsuit. "Levi," he said, smiling like they were old friends. "Didn't think we'd be talking again so soon." Levi kept his expression blank. "Yeah, well, you never did know when to shut up." The moderator cleared his throat, cutting in before the tension could boil over. "Gentlemen, let's keep this civil. Mr. Hensley, you've maintained that you were just doing your job the night you pulled over Agent Tate. Do you still stand by that?" Hensley leaned forward, his smirk widening. "What I stand by is that the FBI overstepped, that they needed a scapegoat and I was convenient. Look, I might have made some mistakes, but let's be real. This whole thing was blown out of proportion. Now, they got Tate here, parading around like some kind of hero. But I got a question for you, Levi. What's changed?" Levi stared at him for a long moment. "Nothing," he finally said. "That's the problem." The moderator shifted. "Can you explain what you mean?" Levi leaned forward slightly. "Hensley's in jail, Warren's on the run. But look around. You still got cops beating people in the streets. You still got politicians covering for them. You still got people watching what happened to me and thinking, well, maybe he deserved it. The system doesn't change just because you take down a couple names. It just finds new ones to replace them." Hensley chuckled, shaking his head. "And yet, here you are, still trying to fight it. Why? What's it even gotten you?" Levi's grip tightened on the armrest of his chair. "You lost your job," Hensley continued. "Lost your family. Hell, half the country hates you. And for what? You think the people cheering for you now are going to be there when this all blows over? You're just another headline, man. They'll move on, and you'll be left with nothing." The moderator tried to cut in again, but Levi spoke first. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe they will. But that doesn't mean I stop." Hensley scoffed. "Why not? You really think you can fix this?" Levi looked into the camera. "No," he said. "But that doesn't mean I let it keep happening." The interview ended, but the debate didn't. The headlines twisted his words, some praising him, others tearing him apart. The threats kept coming. Some people wanted him to run for office, others wanted him dead. A week later, Levi stood outside his old house, staring at the empty driveway. He hadn't been back since Lena left. He didn't even know why he was there. Maybe to convince himself that it wasn't really gone. That if he walked inside, he'd hear Jamal laughing in the other room, see Lena cooking dinner, like none of this had ever happened. But the house was just a house now. Nothing more. His phone rang. It was Hayes. "You got a minute?" Levi sighed. "Yeah, what's up?" "You need to see something." An hour later, Levi was back at the bureau, sitting in a dark room while Hayes clicked through a set of security footage. "This was taken 2 nights ago," Hayes said, outside a bar in El Paso. The video played. A group of men, huddled together, talking in low voices. One of them turned toward the camera, and Levi's stomach dropped. It was Warren, still in the city, still operating despite everything. "You were right," Hayes said. "It wasn't just him. There's a whole network behind this. Corrupt officials, business owners, even some of our own guys. We only scratched the surface." Levi exhaled slowly. He should have known. "This never ends, does it?" he muttered. Hayes gave him a tired look. "Not in our lifetime." Levi nodded. He let the weight of it settle in. He thought about Jamal, about the kind of world his son would grow up in, about the kind of world he wanted to leave behind. He stood, stretching his shoulders. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." Levi Tate's journey is a raw and powerful testament to the cost of fighting for justice in a system built to silence those who challenge it. From the moment he was unjustly arrested to his battle against a corrupt institution, Levi's story is not just about survival. It is about resilience, sacrifice, and the painful truth that justice often comes at a personal cost. What makes his journey so compelling is its brutal realism. He doesn't emerge as a triumphant hero, celebrated and untouchable. Instead, he is broken in ways that cannot be repaired. He loses his family, his career, and any semblance of a normal life. Yet, despite it all, he refuses to stop. He understands that real change doesn't happen overnight, that taking down one man doesn't fix a system designed to protect the powerful. The deeper lesson of Levi's story is that justice is not a destination. It is a continuous fight. The world doesn't change because of one man, but because of those who refuse to be silent, even when it costs them everything. His journey is a painful but necessary reminder that true progress is slow, brutal, and often lonely. But it is always worth the fight. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.